So for this conversation, we're interested in two broadly related issues. First, can divisions over political issues, which are really, I think, more social moral issues, between traditions within Christianity and between Christianity and other faith traditions be resolved both in the interest of enriching the faith community broadly and toward contributing to a flourishing society? And second, how can church leaders use the inevitable political divisions within their congregations as a vehicle through which they can strengthen and develop the spiritual lives of their members and the internal sense of community in the congregation, and be positive contributors and partners to and in their communities? Now, we have three fantastic panel members today to help us think through these issues. First, who many of you know is my friend, Reverend Najuma Smith-Pollard, who usually is the one moderating these, so I get to be Najuma for the day. But for today, because of who she is and what her work is, we decided we needed her voice on the panel. So if you want to watch a fearless and strong faith leader who's not shy or backward about taking on the public responsibility of her faith commitments, keep an eye out for Najuma. In addition to her work at CRCC and the Murray Center, she's pastor of Word of Encouragement Community Church in Los Angeles and is currently involved in multiple task forces and advisory boards, for example, with the Office of the Mayor of Los Angeles and with the Chief of Police. She is following in the footsteps of her mentor in ministry, Reverend Cecil Chip Murray, who just turned 91 the other day. And she's building on his ministry legacy, but she's also blazing her own path in civically engaged faith leadership. Our second guest is Russell Jeung, who I first met a few years ago at a mini conference in Berkeley on theology in California. I was basically the sociological naysayer, and Russell, who's also a sociologist, presented material from what I believe became a book that I think is just fantastic, that I highly recommend, called At Home in Exile. When you see Russell, look to his right, your left, and you'll see the cover of the book behind him. At Home in Exile, Finding Jesus Among My Ancestors and Refugee Neighbors is the title of the book. And the book is both a spiritual memoir and an amazing example of a man who's put his faith into practice in ways that most of us would not consider. And honestly, though, just get on Amazon and, it says see more, read the first couple of pages of the book, and you'll want to keep reading. So go buy that book. And the third guest today is Andrew Whitehead, who's the author, along with Sam Perry, of the recent and timely book, Taking Back America for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. This, again, is another important book because it forces us all to come to terms with what we think about and of this country and the role of religion broadly, as well as how individual adherents and congregations might contribute to a broader conception of America. Now, finally, just a final thought before we get into the conversation. You might have noticed this is a little bit sociology heavy today, but Najuma, the outlier, we can make you an honorary sociologist for whatever that might be worth. But this isn't by accident. We like to bring the academy and the community together. We believe that bringing our findings as resources to faith leaders is helpful to them. It's helpful to us as well. So part of that is introducing you to each other, but it's also introducing you to what we're doing and how that might help you think through the kinds of things you're trying to accomplish in the world. At CRCC, we like to say that we like to call that sociology that matters, or perhaps better, maybe saying that better, making sociology matter in ways that is important in the world. So our format today is slightly different. I'm going to start with Andrew and use some of the findings from his book, who's going to use some of the findings on this book from Christian Nationalism as a way into our larger conversation. But when we were putting this together a couple of weeks ago, I got an email, one of those group emails from Barna Research, if you've heard of them, and there was an interesting finding and something that they've been following for a couple of years. And their finding was that, and this was, by the way, this survey was taken in the spring in the midst of all the social justice protests and marches, and unfortunately many more killings of young African-American people. And the finding was this: the number of, quote, practicing Christians, that is people that are involved in church and have attended, I believe their measure was attended church in the last month, who believe that race issues are, quote, definitely a problem in the US, had shifted from 46% in the summer of 2019 to 43% in the summer of 20. So the practicing Christians have said that that issues of race were definitely a problem, was declining among practicing Christians. And if that wasn't enough, there's an increase of those same practicing Christians who believe that race is not at all a problem in the US. In that same time frame, over a year, it was 11% in 2019 and 19% in 2020. So there's, among practicing Christians, a decline in the belief that race is a particular issue. And then we saw the debate, if you want to call it that, last week, where the current president was unable to disavow white supremacist groups. So there's a lot going on, and this increasingly seeps into our daily lives and into our faith communities. So these are the frames that we want to use this, because we could talk about pretty much anything. So let's on to Andrew here. Two first easy questions to open our discussion. First, what is Christian nationalism and how does it relate to our political moment? And second, how might understanding Christian nationalism help us understand the data that was reported by Barna? Andrew?
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you, Richard. And hello to everybody. I guess it's just afternoon for me here in Indianapolis, so wherever you are, afternoon or morning, it's good to be with you and appreciate the opportunity. And so just to dive right in with what Richard said, actually you can wait on that slide if there's a way to go back. I'll kind of describe Christian nationalism as we define it and as we study it as sociologists, and then throughout our conversation today, I'm happy to circle back or share more of what we find, but I'll try to keep it a little more brief here at the beginning. And so Christian nationalism, we see it as a cultural framework. And so you could think of that really as like lenses through which all Americans, whether they embrace it or reject it, interpret and see their social worlds. And it really advocates and idealizes a close fusion of Christianity. And here you can almost put Christianity in quotes, and I'll get to why here in a second, but a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. So Americans that embrace Christian nationalism believe that America has been and always should be distinctively Christian from top to bottom. So in its self-identity, interpretations of its own history, sacred symbols, cherished values, public policies, it should encompass all of those. And it aims to keep it that way. So it's not only a vision of who we are, but who we should be and how we should get there. But the Christian, again, in Christian nationalism, is more about than just religion. It's about identity. And it carries with it assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, authoritarianism, patriarchy, and militarism, among other things. So let me briefly explain how we measure Christian nationalism, because I think that's important to understand what we find later. And so what we did is we surveyed large numbers of Americans, nationally representative surveys across the population, and we asked them 6 different questions. And these questions, they could either strongly agree or strongly disagree or anywhere in between, with things like the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation, the success of the United States is part of God's plan, the federal government should advocate Christian values, things like this. And so to the degree that they strongly embrace those or they strongly disagree with those, we were able to assign a point value and then put all those together to get a whole scale. And Americans, we find, fall all across this scale. So it isn't just, are you a Christian nationalist or are you not? But there's a degree to which you embrace these things. And that's really important because Americans fall all across it and has implications for civic life and social life. And so we're able to measure Christian nationalism in this way. And then we ask them questions on all sorts of other topics. And what we found over and over the last 6 years that we've been studying this, and then our book that just came out, is that if we're going to understand political and social polarization or divides in our country, not the only thing we have to consider, but one of the key things we do have to consider is Christian nationalism. How much do Americans embrace this idea of Christianity needs to be at the forefront and privileged in civic life? So here are the things that we find, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but I think gets to what Richard introduced to us with the Barna research and other things, is that Americans who embrace Christian nationalism are more likely to approve of authoritarian tactics like demanding people show respect for America and America's traditions and symbols. They have higher degrees of fear and distrust towards religious minorities, especially Muslims, Jewish people, atheists. They tend to condone police violence toward African Americans, and they distrust accounts of racial inequality and in the criminal justice system. They're more likely to believe racial inequality is due to personal shortcomings, and they're more likely to be uncomfortable with interracial marriage or dating, and even transracial adoptions. They tend to be much more anti-immigrant, anti-refugee. They oppose scientists and science education in schools, so they have very clear views of what authority is and who has the authority. And they believe that men are better suited for all areas of leadership. So in the home, in the public sphere, they have very traditional gender views. So again, across a number of different topics, Christian nationalism, we find, is very explanatory in trying to understand polarization. And this, I think, is a key point, coming back to what Richard mentioned about evangelicals, because when we look at support for Donald Trump in 2016, or when we ask them who you'll vote for in the next couple weeks here in 2020, we find that, again, Americans who embrace Christian nationalism are much more likely to vote for Trump in 2016, or say they will, than Americans who reject or resist Christian nationalism. And this is even when we account for their religious tradition. So evangelicals who embrace Christian nationalism are very likely to vote for Trump. But we find those same evangelicals who reject Christian nationalism are much less likely to vote for Trump. They didn't vote for Trump much at all. But we find that even liberal Protestants or Catholics who embrace Christian nationalism, they were much more likely to vote for Trump. So what we're finding is that across religious traditions, even among those that don't affiliate with a religious tradition, if they embrace this idea of a Christian nation, that we need to cherish and value this idea of a Christian nation, they're much more likely to vote for Donald Trump. And this even extends into their views towards race here in this country. And this, I think, dovetails with what Richard was talking about with Barna. So if you want to go to the next slide, or the first slide here. So in this graph, we're able to see the percent of white Americans who agree the most effective way to improve race relations in the US is to stop talking about race. So those four groups at the bottom, rejectors, resistors, accommodators, and ambassadors, correspond to different quartiles of Americans on that scale. So ambassadors are those Americans at the upper quarter of our scale that really embrace Christian nationalism. Accommodators are the next group under them that kind of go from the middle of the scale up to that top quarter. Resistors and rejectors, as you can see, are on the bottom half of that scale and reject Christian nationalism. So there's a clear relationship here. The more that you believe the US is or should be a Christian nation, the more likely you are, the greater number of those Americans believe that the only way to improve race relations is just to stop talking about race, to not bring it up. So if you want to go to the next slide. Here we see when we ask Americans what they fear, and we ask them fears of all sorts of different things, but one was about numerical majorities across race. And here again, we can see that for Americans who embrace Christian nationalism strongly, like ambassadors, or even accommodators that support Christian nationalism or believe that Christianity should play a positive or a big role in American civic life, those two groups are more likely to fear a time when whites are no longer the racial majority in the United States. So we can see that this idea of a Christian nation so far for these Americans has ideas and implications about the racial makeup of that Christian nation. To them, really, this nation, Christian nation, equals to some extent a white nation. So go to the next slide. So these are findings that we have and we talk about in our book that I mentioned earlier. So there on the left, when we ask them how comfortable they would be if their hypothetical daughter married someone who is Black, we can see that as you move up the scale and embrace Christian nationalism more strongly, the more uncomfortable they are with interracial marriage. When we ask them about police violence, they tend to be more likely to turn a blind eye to the racial injustice in policing. So they believe that police treat blacks the same as whites. And then when we ask them what really appears to me to be a much more kind of out there example of a racist belief, that police officers in the United States shoot blacks more often because they are more violent than whites, we see that ambassadors of Christian nationalism, again, are more likely to believe that that is true. So when we think of racial injustice in these terms, we can see that Christian nationalism is a key factor in how they see their social worlds and act within it. But what we find that's really interesting is that Christian nationalism doesn't operate the same way in different racial groups. So for white Americans, who we've been looking at so far, Christian nationalism is really associated with more racial, whether it's implicit or explicit, racist beliefs. But if we go to the next slide, we can see that among African Americans and Black Americans, those that answer those questions the same way, and our ambassadors who believe that the US is a Christian nation, it doesn't work the same way when we're looking at racial injustice issues. So here we are looking at the percent of whites and blacks who agree that, quote, reports of police brutality against Black Americans are exaggerated by the media. So if we focus on the white bars first, these are our white Americans. It is a clear linear relationship that the more that they embrace Christian nationalism, the more likely they are to believe that the media is exaggerating police brutality against Black Americans. Right? Almost 9 out of 10 ambassadors who strongly embrace Christian nationalism think that this is just an exaggeration. But when we look at that blue bar, these are Black Americans in our sample, you can see that Christian nationalism does not have the same effect. Among Black Americans, if you're an ambassador or a rejecter, there's really no difference, right? They are equally likely to believe that the media is not exaggerating police brutality. So this tells us something about this idea of a Christian nation and what it means among these different groups. So for white Americans, a stronger embrace of Christian nationalism results in being much more likely to believe that, again, these things are exaggerated by the media. But for Black Americans, no matter how strongly they embrace it, they're just as likely to disagree. If we go to the last figure I have here. Now this is looking at the percent of whites and blacks who believe blacks face a lot of discrimination. Again, if we focus on the white bars, you can see a clear linear relationship. It gets much smaller. So accommodators and ambassadors are much less likely to believe that blacks face a lot of discrimination. But when we look at among Black Americans, this embrace of Christian nationalism, again, makes no difference. They're equally likely to believe that blacks face a lot of discrimination. So Christian nationalism then operates differently for those groups that have historically had access to cultural and political power, like white Americans. For those groups on the outside, Christian nationalism does not have the same effect. And so we can look at the history of Frederick Douglass to Martin Luther King Jr. to Reverend Barber today of Black Americans saying that they would say, yes, this is a Christian nation, but call it to account. If this is truly a Christian nation, then how can you treat your citizens this way? And we can see that represented here. But for white Americans, that relationship is not there. And so I think to be more precise, as we look at religion in America and religious Americans, we can't just talk in terms of evangelicals, and we can't just talk in terms of religious people or those that attend church. But what we need to focus on is this cultural framework of Christian nationalism that is widely accepted by evangelicals and those that attend church a lot. But if you reject Christian nationalism, it doesn't matter if you're an evangelical or if you attend church a lot. You're much more likely to be pro-social or to believe blacks when they say they're facing discrimination, believe that there is injustice in the criminal justice system. And so I think I'll try to kind of leave it here.
I would argue, like you said, that white Christian nationalism is a particular racialized cultural framework that's actually leading to, my book was called At the Church in Exile. I think it's leading to the decline of the church in the United States, as there's been a backlash against Obama among white Christian nationalists. And so they've sort of supported Trump in fervent ways to maintain their lifestyle, to maintain their privilege, to maintain their sort of to hold their fears at bay. And so I think really the way it's operating is that as they've sort of doubled down on white Christian nationalism, it's actually led the church in decline as millennials and Gen Z see the church as being hypocritical and inauthentic. It's clearly, for my community, driven Asian Americans towards the Democratic Party. There's been a hard shift so that now we're a clear racial voting bloc. So a third of us voted Democrat in 1992. Now it's 75% are voting Democrat. And it's because we've been pushed away by white Christian nationalism that doesn't include us in their boundaries, that we're not part of the America that they see as their identity. And so even Asians who, like Andrew talked about, Asians who embrace Christian nationalism, they're really sort of stuck with this cognitive dissonance. Do I follow my faith, or do I have to disavow who I am as an Asian American? Because there's such stark boundaries among white Christian nationalists.
Najuma, you're muted.
Thank you. And Andrew, Andrew, really great work that you've done there. My sentiment is the same as Russell's. And two things I would say, what you presented in numbers, I think is what Black folks have known all along. We just didn't have the numbers to say it, right? So it's good to see it in a framework that where you have actual numbers and charts and things like that. But I think this is the thing that Black folks have been saying, especially those that do work in justice movements, is there's a very clear line of delineation about the definition of what it means to be Christian in this nation and what Christian nationalism really is. And it's different for white Christian nationalists and Blacks who are Christian, who support this nation being rooted in its Christianity to whatever degree that means. And I would also add to that, of the Black folks that were polled, I would ask the question, which Black folks? Probably more privileged, probably more education, probably having more access to power, access to resources, because just that it would also kind of create a divide between but what Black folks were actually polled for this. And so, because even within Black Christianity, and Richard and I have talked about this before, there is still some divide, right? Because you have those who are Christian, but really don't see this nation as living out its Christianity. And then there are Black folks who are Christian who support a very conservative viewpoint of Christianity, which is closely aligned to the Christian nationalism. So I think that's another area that can be looked at and even discussed, because even within the Christian framework for Black folks, there's a divide. Yeah.
Sure. That's a great entree to the rest of our conversation, but let me have Andrew reply both, because Najuma, and by the way, Najuma, you've got a nice sociological imagination going on there. So you are part of the crew. You are part of the sociology crew. Andrew, can you respond quickly? Then we want to get on, because we're going to do some, we got about 25 minutes, but
yeah,
not for you. But
yeah. Yeah. Well, let me start here. No, that sounds great. Thank you, Russell and Reverend Najuma, for those thoughts. And I agree 100%. This cultural framework is racialized, and those last couple of slides, I think, lay that out. And so kind of an example that happened just yesterday, I believe it was Eric Trump. I don't know if anybody's on Twitter or what he had to say in an interview, that he said his father has basically saved Christianity. And so many, they would wonder, okay, how do you save Christianity? What does that even mean? There's no way. But I think for me, if you think of it in terms of the Christianity he's talking about is white Christian nationalism, then it's kind of a decoder ring. It all falls into place. And in that sense, he isn't wrong. I mean, Trump and his policies have been intent on meeting the desires of the Christian nationalist crowd, which is nativist, white, and racist, and fearing immigrants and refugees, traditional gender roles, all of those things. And so in many ways, this cultural framework is And when you hear the rhetoric from the White House, I think in terms of when they say Christianity, thinking that Christianity means this white Christian nationalism, it really helps make sense of a lot of the choices they make and what they're doing. And then, I mean, just today, you know, not surprising, but the horrific comments they made about we need to separate children from their mothers at the border, right? That they did it explicitly. So again, these nativist tendencies, that is white Christian nationalism in action. And the us of white Christian nationalism is that group maintaining privilege and power that they've had since before the founding of the US until now. And so I think wrestling with that as people of faith is of the utmost importance, and then how to, what that means for those groups as Russell and Reverend Najuma talked about. So yeah, thank you.
And all of this really, to me, suggests what we're really trying to figure out here today. I mean, well, let's face it, this is like the very surface of what we can do. We're talking for an hour and a half, but these are deep divisions within, not only within Christianity, not only within our country, but within individual congregations. And it's difficult because of the sort of fundamental nature of how people understand that and how that frames, as Andrew said earlier, that cultural view frames the way they understand the world to overcome those. In fact, this is my question. So where can Christians or people from other faith traditions engage, or how, maybe would be the other way to say this, engage in productive discussions and dialogue when there's a lack of agreement between them over what even the orthodox teachings of their faith are? Because these are so deeply ingrained. I have been part of and witnessed conversations where it becomes, it's just an impossibility to get over that divide, or at least it seems to be an impossibility. I tend to be an optimist and think, oh, if we just talk a little bit more. But is that even true? I mean, how can this happen when the fundamental reality is in conflict with each other? And that's an open question to the three of you.
I'll jump in with something that is actually happening in Los Angeles, and Shalanda's husband, Shep Crawford, is a part of that. We are preparing an action here in Los Angeles with a bunch of clergy. And the thing that's allowed us to come together, because within just a small group of pastors from in and around Los Angeles, maybe about 50 of us, there you have that divide, very conservative, not so conservative, then you got a little bit of BLM thrown in there. And so in our conversation, everybody's like, yeah, but, you know. And so what we came to terms about, which is allowing us to move forward in our conversation and the action, is something we use the term called operational unity. I don't know who made that up. It was a great term and it worked. And I think where there are opportunities for operational unity, like we're unifying for a purpose, for an operation, understand that we all kind of see this Christianity piece different, and we all have their great divisions. And so where there's opportunity for operational unity, that may be where congregations can come together, and even within congregations where the leadership, the pastor can say, I understand we got a divide, a split in our congregation, but for this operation, for this moment, for this particular cause, how do we, can we unify? And that's just something that we've had to work through it, but we're using, and we have to keep pushing that up front, operational unity, because at the end of the day, as African-American clergy, African-American Latinx clergy, we have an ultimate goal, which we are unified about. How we get there might be different, but we're unified in what we want. And so we're operationalizing our unity for that purpose, if that helps.
Yeah, actually, Najuma's approach of operational unity, I think if that's what's happening in the Asian American church too. For the first time, I've seen different theological perspectives come together. And ironically, what's bringing the Asian American church community together is white Christian nationalism. The spate of racism that Asian Americans are experiencing during COVID-19 is causing alarm for the entire community. We're, again, like African Americans, are physically experiencing that racism in bodily ways, and really clearly see how Trump is fomenting that type of racism. And so that's brought together the church, again, to fight against the racism we're experiencing. So it is operational. We're coming together against a threat to our boundaries. Another thing I think the American church should learn, and part of the divide for me, is how individualistic the church is, of needing to have your voice heard, seen, and acknowledged. And I think in the Asian church, we've always had pluralism, we've always had diversity, but I think we've had a sense of collectivism that comes from our Asian backgrounds that held us together in unity, that we always valued the group and group loyalty over our need to have our individual rights heard or to have our individual theologies demanded. And so I think one way the church could hopefully get out of it, and you talked about what are the disciplines or the spiritualities that we could employ to bridge this chasm, would be to have the Christian virtues of humility, of submission, which is sort of unheard of in these days, values of wanting the best for the other. I think those sort of collectivist values are part of the problem with Christian nationalism, is that it's too American, it's too individualistic, it's too whitewashed. And so for the church to be redeemed and to develop unity, I think we have to get outside of that white Christian framework, cultural framework.
Yeah, I mean, what strikes me is that to get over that kind of fundamental, understanding of, well, I think Russell's right. One is on this sort of individualistic versus, more collective. And I'm not even sure if collectivist is the right word, but, something where you're concerned about the other, the group means something important. But also the basically the understandings of orthodoxy. And I wonder if you could each in some way or have a conversation about the notion of, because this is something that I see in it as well. I think it's in the American idea of individualism and the inability to understand structures that inhibit or enable people to move forward in life and to allow them to have different kinds of life chances. Several years ago, two colleagues of mine, one of whom is on this call, Brad Christensen and Corey Edwards, is at University. We wrote a book, published a book on teenagers and race, and how race, independent of other variables, influences their trajectories and their life trajectories. And our argument basically was a structural one. It's like, it's not just you. Anybody can pick themselves up and do whatever it's all structured in different kinds of ways. And that seems to be a real difficulty for Americans to get their minds around, that there are structural impediments to people, and there's structural, I guess, causeways for other people, and it's largely race. So I'll just throw that out there because I think that's an important point that Russell brings up. Any comments about how to even get people thinking beyond the individual to these other kinds of issues that are important, to help them understand that that's what we're really talking about here. All right, I just stumped everybody. That's nice. When you can stump sociologists, it's good. So let's borrow a phrase from our term from Andrew's book, The Ambassadors, and what ways can we think about creating a more pluralistic society in which all faiths and people with no faith are recognized as legitimate and equal, rather than insisting on a more restrictive and hierarchical social order that favors one particular group. Because I think that goes down into the individual congregations that we're really ultimately in this project concerned about. It's like, if my way is the only right way, then that makes conversations, it makes growth, it makes service, frankly, to other people very difficult. How can that kind of idea be instilled in people that are apparently as divided as they seem to be?
I could take a first stab at this. I think, I think there are some groups that are working, across religious traditions. So one of those is Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And so you can find them online. But so these are cross traditions. And then two of them, they're working with, non-religious or unaffiliated Americans too. I think the kind of what the main impediment for me is that for white Christian nationalism, it is singularly focused on power. And it only wants power, and it isn't going to give up power willingly. And so I really kind of question whether or not making progress is going to be changing the hearts and minds of people that have grown up and been in communities and have social networks that are enmeshed with Christian nationalism, or it's going to take basically being able to make moves, in positions of power that demand a pluralistic democratic society, that every group gets a say. And then those ideas and what they see the world should be are going to have to change with that. So it's kind of changing policy before changing minds. I don't know if we're not going to be able to change hearts and minds to a degree that then policy is going to follow. And that's not an idea that I've had. Others smarter than me have said that, and using them. I think Dr. Kendi is one that has said that. And so focusing on that. And so in that sense, I think it's incumbent on those, whether they're religious Americans who reject Christian nationalism or resist it, those non-religious Americans who reject it or resist it, but those people that view this as a threat to a pluralistic democratic society, which my colleague Sam Perry and I, we do believe that it is. They want to see their world enshrined in policy. And so seeing that it is, a detriment to that and a threat to that, working towards gaining access to those levers of power to ensure that whether you are non-religious or a minority religion or a racial ethnic minority or an immigrant or whoever, that you aren't going to be placed on the outside, as Russell's brought up, that the boundaries are going to be expanded to include you rather than exclude you. I see that as really the only way to make progress on it. I'm just skeptical of being able to change hearts and minds, one by one, which gets at your structural point.
Right. Russell, Najuma?
Go ahead, Russell.
Either.
I have all these debates with my old college roommate who is an Asian American Christian nationalist. And it's sort of like, it's the same questions, like how do you talk to someone across the political divide? And it's really, really hard. And again, because we're so entrenched in our own perspectives and think of ourselves as being right and think of not only are we right, but it's sort of God-ordained rightness. Mm-hmm. And for me, I think what would actually lead to an opening, let's say for the Christian nationalist mindset, is actually to see their own world shrinking, to see the church, if they could clearly see the church is in decline, if you could see the number of baptisms in the church, shrinking, if they could see people leaving the church, I think that would sort of threaten their own sort of church numbers, and then their numbers would then have to awaken them to a revisiting of how they do church, preach church, how they be Christian entrepreneurs. So I always wonder, like, who's driving this Christian nationalism? Who's benefiting from it, besides white people in general? But who are the entrepreneurs? Who are the authors? Who are the theologians who are driving it? Why are they benefiting so much for maintaining it? And then if you sort of like weaken that base, then maybe that drive for that nationalism would dissipate a bit.
Najuma?
Yeah, so I thank you for that question. So two things I want to just kind of share. One, I think that white Christian nationalists do see their numbers changing. But I think in seeing that, it fuels to Andrew's point, their tenacity to be totally unmovable. They don't see the threat as an opportunity to change, but the threat as an opportunity to be obstinate. Like, I'm digging in even harder in this because they do see, I think they do see it. Ray Charles could see it, right? So they do see it. They know it. They know they're losing. They know in 20 years, their numbers are going to be very, 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 and not even 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, but it's given them reason to be all the more obstinate and all the more abrasive. The other thing I wanted to add to that, I would actually say, Flory, is we have to maybe even, I know we use the word reimagine a lot. We might need to reimagine what progress means. We might have to begin to think about, like, what are we, when we say progress, we might have to begin to reimagine, what are we talking about when we say progress? And progress how? Progress for who? Progress when? And progress how fast? Like we have to reframe that, because some would argue progress has been made, but that depends on what side of the fence you're on, if you're in the cage or you're not in the cage, right? And so I think we have to reframe. If we're going to talk about progress and change, we have to reimagine and reframe that definition, and then figure out, like, what perspective are we giving that from? Like, are we saying progress from the person, from the child that's in the cage, or progress from the person that gets to go to college? Mm-hmm. And that's two different levels of progress. And so I think we have to have a unified thought on where progress begins from. Like, what's the starting point? Because ask a child or a parent that's in the cage, they'll say progress ain't been made. Ask the person who's not eating, progress has not been made. So, I mean, I think it just depends on where we have to reimagine this whole concept and conversation around what progress is.
Yeah, there's so much here we could be going for a long time. Interestingly, to Russell's point about who benefits, I have this phrase that I talk about, the Christian industrial complex, that involves all the colleges and the media organizations and the publishing houses and everything. They have this kind of stuff, and so you get this sort of thing. And to Najuma's point about, sometimes, even though people know there's decline, they then get more entrenched in their perspective. We just published a book in the spring, and then got lost in COVID, on emerging adults and religion, and everybody's in trouble because young people are leaving across the board. But what we find is there's this hollowing out of the middle. There's more people claiming not religion, more people in the middle where it's completely and totally irrelevant to their lives, even if they identify. And then there's which we started calling the remnant, that are involved, and they're becoming more religious. And that's the point at which a lot of these organizations are focusing on, but that number seems to be decreased, at least among younger people. We'll see over time. So let's get, because we're gonna, in a few minutes, we're gonna move to the parish here, but I want to spend some time talking about, in particular congregations, how does this work out? I mean, you're standing around having coffee or whatever you're doing, or the pastor is preaching or whatever the service is, and there's this cognitive dissonance going on among different groups of people in the same congregation. And how do you have conversations about these things at that sort of micro level, where it really, really is important in terms of interpersonal relationships, short of doing what I've done before, which is say something really stupid and then feel bad about it almost immediately afterward. Like I told my dad one time he shouldn't get his news from a fat drug addict on the radio. And you can think about that for a minute. And I realized as soon as I said that, I should not have said that. So how do we do that? How on that interpersonal, in a community where we want to be together with people, but we have these large differences? No answer.
Yeah. What? I think the answer is, well, I mean, I can only speak for myself.
Yeah.
I get to lean into being a pastor and the prophetic voice, which is to tell the truth. And so being a truth teller, and I think, and that's risky, right? And all of us on this call, everyone, even those that are watching and those who watch the video, I mean, it's the conversation itself is risky. And then you take the risk of telling it and speaking truth. And because, everybody may not like the truth, even if I haven't had a lot of conversation with white nationalists, but I've had a few, or who have very strong views and opinions. I actually have a friend who's a police officer, and he and I have, we've had our moments going back and forth. But I think at the end of the day, every individual has to hold to truth. And, that's really all you can do. But in an effort to move an agenda forward, if the conversation is about moving an agenda forward, because to Andrew's point, I don't know, you can change, you can't, like, and we've had this conversation even with the chief of police, like, he was like, what kind of training you think can happen? Chief, you cannot train away an officer who has an implicit bias and criminalizes anybody of color. That is not a training issue. You cannot train that away. That person just has to be dealt with on an accountability system, period. And so it depends on what the objective is and what the goal is. That sets the stage for the conversation. But again, you know, and that's where it comes, like, what's the goal of the conversation? Are we trying to move an agenda forward? Then we have to figure out where we have commonality or common ground or our unity. If it's just conversation, then I have to take the risk of telling the truth from where I sit and where I stand. But that may be, but you cannot talk the problem away. That's what I'm trying to say.
Right, and that's actually my question underneath it is these aren't just differences of opinion. These are real life issues of how people are treated and how their opportunities and chances in life are affected. Chances in life such that they may die. And so, you know, so how do you, that is a visit about, let alone, you know, reimagining progress, right?
Yeah, if I can jump in here, I really, you know, resonate with what Najuma had to say, and kind of going back to, you know, sociologist, his name escapes me right now, but he had a book that came out a number of years ago, but he talked about faithful presence in the world. So for Christians, rather than trying to go after power and privilege, having a faithful presence around them. But I think too, it's an important point that as a, you know, a sociologist or a social scientist, we know that little changes without access again to power. And so for me, being a person of faith in white evangelical churches, it is very uncomfortable for me with much of what is embraced, from where, if I can just kind of share kind of my own personal thing, where I fall on this Christian nationalism and being a rejecter. And so I have to, you know, listening to different kind of leaders and speakers, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove is one that I really appreciate, where for me as a white man, where this country has been set up for me and to basically just work for me, I have to stand with the marginalized and find those voices and sit with them and follow them and be a part of what they're doing, because it's only through gaining that access to power that things are going to change. Again, you know, with what others have said, I don't think it's going to be a thing where we can change individual hearts and minds, but in those spaces, trying to consistently share where we are and raise questions about some of the assumptions that it has. But yeah, unless there's access to power, I don't see it changing.
Russell, can you take a couple minutes, then we're going to move into the sort of pairing people up. Any final
I'll just
thoughts?
throw out something just to be controversial.
Good. We don't have enough controversy here today.
I don't think we could resolve tensions or talk it out.
Yeah.
The whole notion of unity based on we have a common goal that we haven't, we're going to operationalize and work towards together. That's very American too. This activist orientation and this talk it out to resolve conflict orientation is very American. So let me give you a different Asian way to deal with the issue. Rather than trying to it all out, maybe you could just acknowledge that the tension is this. The truth is that we have our differences, but again, we don't need to talk it out. We could actually allow silence and humility, because we value unity more than our need to be truthfully correct. So it's a matter of, do we value truth and action, or grace and the church just being the church rather than the church doing something? So if the church just being the church is the foremost value, that we're connected by the Spirit and value that more than our political differences, that would actually, it would just be a shift in priorities basically. So for Asian, like Chinese churches, they have to deal with Hong Kong, China, and Taiwan issues, but they're all in the same church because they don't talk about it. And that actually maintains the unity, and they could be the church together. Maybe they don't move forward, maybe they have this sort of forced harmony, but it is a way to actually value each other in a different way, acknowledging the difference. A lot of times, in your marriage or a family, you realize you're different, you quit fighting over it, and you just sort of coexist. And maybe that's not fully reconciled in a Western way, but it's still being family together.
I'm sorry, we have to stop you. So we're going to get a little bit more here. First of all, this has been fantastic. If we could go longer, we would. But we want to recognize your time in that. So thank you for joining us. And this is the third of our 3 for the fall. This is not the end. And we hope you learned something that you can take back both for your personal life, also your into your congregations, but we also hope that you're developing some relationships. I mean, honestly, one of the great things for us is that we're developing relationships with people we kind of know, but we didn't really know that well. And we intend to continue to develop that as we go on. So this, as I said, is the final conversation for the fall. But as I noted in my introductory comments, we're working on more conversations for the new year, as well as other programming. And in addition, we're purposely developing a way digitally to develop our community of learning and support. So we'll be sending out an invitation to join a digital platform through which that kind of work will be taking place, hopefully. And then ultimately, I really hope this is true. Ultimately, we can actually get back in personal, physical, human contact with each other at some point in the not too distant future, without jeopardizing all of our lives, because I don't think any of us are going to resurrect like the president did. Sorry, I just had to put that in there. Anyway, we'll be sending out that invitation, so please keep an eye out for that. And if you have any questions about you can look at the website there. There's more questions there. If you have any other questions about it, send them to the USC CRCC email. We appreciate your being here with us. We value your participation, and please keep an eye out for any emails from us, and well, today's only Wednesday. I was going to say have a great weekend, but have a good rest of the week, and ultimately have a good weekend. And thank you for your participation. Thanks to our panel before we leave. Thank you. Bye.